My name is Ben Cowan. I'm a painter and an artist. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I grew up in Michigan, and I moved to New York about 5 years ago to pursue being an artist full-time and living my dream. My paintings are Brooklyn-centric. They're about the landscape and the things that I see every day between my studio and home, or kind of traveling around Brooklyn. So like everybody in Brooklyn's kind of packed together and we all sort of fight for space, and then these paintings are really tight and like claustrophobic, but there's a unity and a sense of place and kind of hopefulness there, I think. The paintings about Brooklyn, I think that they're about Brooklyn as a place, but they're also about me as a person living in Brooklyn and just the struggle and the trial of New York. And it seems like a kind of common theme of every person's life in New York City to talk about their life in New York City, but it's a real thing when you're here of like just the struggle to kind of be here and work and make a living. Like my heart is this kind of mediary between the spirit and the work. And so rather than try to force some sort of like faith idea or spiritual idea into the work, what I did was start working on my heart and trying to like bring those kinds of spiritual and religious ideas into my heart, and then just make work that was honest and not really worry so much about if those things would tie together or not, but just believe in the process of like making the best work I can, make the most honest work that I can, and just follow my artistic interests and trust that that will in some way, be reflective of my heart and then what God is doing in that. And what I came to was really more like, how do I compose a painting so that there's an expression of community and relationship between the objects and the color that's evocative or emotional rather than descriptive. And so I think these paintings are kind of eccentric and kind of a little bizarre and a little worrisome psychologically, because there's no way in or out, and they're a little aggressive but with nice clothes on. So they're like colorful and sort of upbeat, but personally I think they're a little looming of tragedy, or like a little sorrowful or longing for something else. And part of that is just there's no way in or out. So I have a painting called Jordan's in the Air, and it's kind of a precursor to the Gate series. It features a wall, an oak tree with shoes dangling in it that happen to be Air Jordans. It has like a youthful play to it. These shoes are maybe outgrown by a kid or a young adult, and then they're thrown into a tree and they're kind of caught there. It also has a reference to like an ascension of sorts. So shoes, I was just fascinated by these specific shoes that I would walk through. I'd walk under them on my way to the studio every day. And I would think, oh, shoes belong on the ground. They're in the air. They've ascended. And so part of that painting is like about that, or it's like about, death, passing, or something like that. So a lot of the paintings are framed with molding that I've actually bought from a Brooklyn reuse place. It's like antique molding that's been gutted out of a building that's under renovation. So I recondition it and cut it up and make these frames. So the framing is based off of the doorways of Brooklyn brownstones, or like the windows, or they kind of look like mantelpieces or something too that would be in the building. Like the paintings themselves are of Brooklyn architecture, and then I'm using Brooklyn architecture to kind of frame it. I was sort of possessed by the idea to do it, and I was like, I have to do this. I have to put my painting in one of these things. And then doing it really charged the work. It gave a weight to the flatness of the painting in a way that I was really excited about. And then it also started to harken back and reference some of those like medieval and Renaissance iconography pieces or altarpieces that are in churches. So there are these kind of neutral Brooklyn scenes, but set up for the viewer in a way to become devotional imagery. In the Van der Weyden, if you kind of reduce it to its motions, the compositional motions, there's sort of these two parentheses on the edge, and then they sort of make a figure eight kind of cross X in the middle with a vertical piece that is the cross in the Van der Weyden. And then Christ and Mary are both in the same position. They're in like a sympathetic pose. And so in the landscape version, I found these flowers mimicking or kind of sympathizing with the fleur-de-lis wrought iron gate motif. And I kind of saw that as like a Jesus and Mary like the flower is fleeting, and then you have this iron piece that's permanent. And then in the Van der Weyden, you know, he's dead. And then Mary's kind of like on her way out. She's fainting, but she's gonna stick around. I think it kind of sets up a little bit of how I see the landscape. Not just of like, here's a bush, it's a bush, but like, here's a bush next to another bush. It's a character, it's supporting, and it's gesturing, and it's doing this thing. And in Van der Weyden, all these characters are not just individuals, they're sort of functioning as a community that are being buried with Christ in the painting. In the Brooklyn version, I kind of see all these plants and bushes and architecture as these kind of characters that are sort of mingling in this garden, kind of pointing and gesturing and moving us around with this lily and iron piece kind of as the center point. So I'm like thinking about working towards like a better state of life or a state of mind or upward mobility, and like the upward mobility of the spirit. The ascending plan, I kind of intentionally call it that to sort of gather some of the spiritual implications of the word ascension or ascending. One of the paintings that's a part of the Ascending Plant series is subtitled Shadow of the Former. And it's two plants that are the same pot, the same plant. One's in the light in the foreground and one's a few steps up in the shadow. And the one in the shadow is just kind of weak and looks a little miserable. And the one in the light is like, it's full and looks glorious. And so this was just one of the stoops that I kind of found walking around the neighborhood. And immediately what happens is I just start seeing a narrative between these two plants, and the phrase shadow of the former came to mind. Kind of a humorous reference to something that's no longer as glorious as it once was, but then it makes a visual joke because it's a plant in the light and one in the shadow, and so it's a shadow of the thing that's in the former. Well, I think part of what's attractive about painting the landscape is that it's very neutral, or at least it can be, and where, you know, whereas painting a person or an individual, you have to deal with who that person is or what kind of person they are, or like what's the gesture they're making. And so there's a lot of context and history and things like that. And there's history in landscape and references that it's making, but in the end, it's a more neutral subject matter. So I'm able to kind of express a little cleaner my idea on top of that kind of neutral thing. And a potted plant is like, it's like the color beige. It kind of means nothing. But to try and make something meaningful out of it is a fun challenge, and I think can work well with the kind of ideas that I'm trying to communicate about community or relationships. You know, some of my favorite landscape painters are like George Inness and Turner and Constable, and there's a kind of mysterious spiritualism that's in them. A lot of it's communicated through light and the organization of space and the kind of story that those abstract elements tell. What's interesting to me being in Brooklyn is there's kind of a lack of connection to soil. You know, there's a lot of cement and architecture. But so what I start to see is this interaction of where nature is breaking through that urban life and sort of reinforcing itself. So you have plants growing up through wrought iron gates, or, you know, like the lovely tree that jets out of the crack of the sidewalk or something, and you have to pay to repair it. But nature's sort of unstoppable in a way that in New York City, we're aware of the power of human existence and the kind of dominance that we have on the earth, but nature doesn't cease to creep in. And so I kind of see those two forces as two things straddling for control and also coexistence, and we depend on both of them. And I feel like good art shapes the way that you see the world in a different way. My effort, I guess, is to just make a small shift in each person that sees my painting to, you know, not have my point of view, but maybe they can see the world in a little more subtle way, or pick up or slow down a little bit to just notice something. Like, you know, the work that I'm making is the result of usually being stopped in my tracks by just a leaf folding over a piece of wrought iron. And like, I have to stop, and I'm like late for something, whatever, but I'll stop and just spend some time with a leaf on the sidewalk looking like a crazy person. But this moment of beauty has captured me and energized my imagination in a way that starts to bring up memories or, relationships that I'm in or want to be in or having, and to have another person engage with that in their own walk and their own kind of everyday life, I think is really magical. I help curate shows with a collective, and we curate under the name SFF, spelled out sort of phonetically, ESSEFEFF. So it's a kind of non sequitur, like doesn't really mean anything specific, but what we've done is we do shows kind of pop-up style in the hallway here at my studio. There's like a really big space that is just kind of up for grabs to use for whatever purpose of the residents here. And it's really built a kind of an amazing community of painters and artists and other curators and a few collectors that will come out to the shows regularly. So we rotate taking turns curating shows and a whole span of ideas about what each show is. So you can go to one show up here and another show down there, and there's the zeitgeist of the arts is here, and you kind of catch it as you participate in it over a period of time. And it's something I knew existed, but I wasn't really aware of until having lived here. I have a show coming up next spring, and I'm anticipating being a part of some other group shows soon. I just finished a few shows last month, so I'm always looking for opportunities to be published or be in shows or just be a part of the community in general. Like being an artist in New York, you always have a few things up your sleeve. You're always like trying to do a couple of things, and actually like participating in communities like this that are discussing the intersection of faith or just any religion and the arts in general is really fascinating to me. Art was birthed out of a need to communicate some kind of a spiritual idea, and I feel like continuing that conversation, just being a part of that lineage is really exciting. Future is a hopeful thing. I'm anticipating a one-person show next year, and hopefully more of that to come.